Let me ask you something before I start. Have you ever stood on a beach at night, looked up at the stars and felt small, like the sky was too big and you were just a little speck of nothing under it? Hold on to that feeling. Because there was a time not so long ago when the things up in those stars looked down at us the same way. Small, cheap, easy. They had a word for us out there. The traders used it. The slavers used it. It didn't translate clean into any human tongue, but the closest you'd get is soft cargo. That's what we were, soft cargo. My name is Corin Vale. I'm an old man now. My hands shake when I hold a cup. But I'm going to tell you about the night they came to Saltmero, and what one woman did on the docks, and why nobody out there in the dark calls us soft cargo anymore. Stay with me, this one's worth it. Saltmero wasn't much. I want you to picture it the way it really was, not the way the records dress it up. It wasn't a city. It wasn't even a proper town by the standards of the inner colonies. It was a fishing settlement on the edge of a shallow green sea, on a world we called Murith, and Murith was the kind of place you ended up when you had nowhere better to go. The sky there was always a little too bright. Two suns, one big and orange, one small and white, so the shadows never quite agreed with each other. By midday everything had two shadows pulling in two directions, and as a kid I used to chase mine, trying to stand in a spot where they overlapped and I had none at all. The sea wasn't blue. It was this thick glassy green, full of something the old folks called sea rice, and the harvesters would go out at low tide in long flat boats and rake it up by the ton. We ate it, we dried it, we shipped it. That was the whole economy, more or less. Sea rice and the little silver fish that lived in it. We were poor. I'll be honest about that. The colony charter had promised us automated harvesters and weather control and a proper orbital dock, and what we got was a rusting transfer station that worked maybe 4 days out of 7. And a single supply run every 2 standard months if the freighter captains felt like coming this far out. But it was ours. I keep saying that because it matters for later. It was ours. I lived with my mother and my younger sister, Tem, in a house on stilts at the western end of the harbor. My father had gone out on a deep-water harvest 3 years before and the sea had kept him. That happened. The sea kept people. We didn't talk about it much. My mother just got quieter and worked harder, and there were 2 empty places at our table that never filled up again. So that was me, 14 years old, skinny, bad at fishing, worse at fixing nets, always getting in trouble for wandering up the cliff road instead of working. And I want you to understand we were happy, not rich happy, just ordinary happy. We didn't know what was coming, and that's a mercy when I look back on it. We got to be ordinary right up until the last hour. What was out there? Now I have to tell you about the dark. When I was small, the dark between stars was just a story. The galaxy had its big powers, the old federations, the trade combines, the council worlds with their fleets and their laws. Murith was too far out to matter to any of them. We were on the frayed edge of the map, in a region the charts marked with a thin gray haze and a note that more or less said here be nothing. Except it wasn't nothing. Out past the haze, where no patrol ever swept and no law ever reached, there were people. Not human, older than us by a long way. And among them, in the deep cold between the dead systems, there were the ones we'd come to call the Corsairs of the Black Tide. I'll tell you what I learned about them later the hard way, but the short version is this. They were a raiding culture, ancient. They didn't build, they didn't farm, they didn't make much of anything. What they did was take. They had a fleet of ships that ran dark and silent, painted in a black that drank the light, and they would drift into the soft edges of inhabited space, and they would harvest. Not goods, people. The galaxy ran on labor, you see. The big combines needed workers for the places machines broke down and people were cheaper to replace. The deep mines, the rad fields, the pressure farms on the crushing worlds. Nobody respectable would sell you a slave. There were laws. There were treaties. Everyone was very civilized about it. but nobody asked too hard where the labor came from, and the corsairs were happy to fill that gap. They'd raid a soft world, scoop up a few hundred souls, run them through one of the lawless hub stations, and by the time those people were sold and shipped and put to work, the paperwork said they were indentured volunteers, and everyone could sleep at night. Everyone except the people in the mines. And here's the part that I think about most. We never saw them coming, not because they were so clever, but because we were so beneath their notice that nobody had ever bothered to warn us. There was no early warning network on the edge worlds, no defense grid. The Combines didn't protect places like Saltmorrow because places like Saltmorrow weren't worth protecting. We were unguarded, unwatched, unwanted. Which is exactly what makes a place worth raiding. The last ordinary day. The day it happened started like nothing. I remember it was a high tide day, which meant no harvest, which meant I was free. I'd climbed the cliff road before either sun was properly up, with a heel of bread in my pocket and a vague idea about catching wind crabs in the rocks. My mother had told me to be back by midday to help mend the long nets. I had no intention of being back by midday. The morning was clear. I want you to feel how clear it was because it matters. There was a high cold wind off the sea, and the air had that scrubbed, sharp smell it gets after a storm, and the two suns were climbing and the whole harbor down below me looked like a toy somebody had set out on a green table. The boats, the drying racks, the smoke from the cook fires going up straight and thin. I sat up on the rocks and ate my bread and watched a freighter come down. That was the first wrong thing, though I didn't know it. We weren't due a supply run. I remember thinking it was early, and then thinking maybe I'd lost track of the days, which I did all the time. It came down slow through the high air, a fat gray shape, and it settled out beyond the harbor mouth the way the supply freighters did, too big for our little dock. I watched it for a while. I even waved at it like an idiot. Then I went back to the crabs, because I was 14 and a freighter was the most boring thing in the world. It was maybe an hour later that I noticed the harbor had gone quiet. Not silent, quiet. The kind of quiet where you can't say what's missing until you really listen. And what was missing, I figured out slowly, lying up there in the warm rocks, was the ordinary noise of the town. The clatter, the calling. The little engine on the ice house that ran all day, all of it had stopped. I sat up. Down in the harbor, the people had come out of their houses. I could see them, little figures, gathered in the open space by the main dock where the freighter's launch had pulled in. They were standing very still, all facing the same way. And I remember the exact moment my stomach turned over, because I'm an old man and I've forgotten a lot, but I have never once forgotten this. The figures by the launch, the ones the whole town was facing, they were too tall. People don't read scale well at a distance, but you know your own kind. You know how tall a person is the way you know your own name. And these things standing on our dock were a full head and shoulders above the tallest man in Saltmorrow, and they were the wrong shape, narrow and long. And even from up on the cliff I could see that they were holding something, and that the something was pointed at my neighbors. I should have run down. I tell myself that sometimes in the bad hours. I should have run down to my mother and my sister. I didn't. I lay flat in the rocks and I shook and I watched. And the cold truth is that lying flat in the rocks is the only reason I'm alive to tell you any of this. Let me describe them. I've had 60 years to get it right. The corsairs weren't monsters. That's the first thing people get wrong when I tell this. They weren't slavering beasts. They were elegant. That was almost the worst of it. They stood maybe 7 feet, on legs that bent the wrong way like a bird's. Their skin, if it was skin, was a deep blue-black smooth with a faint oily shine, and across it ran lines of pale light that pulsed slow, like a heartbeat you could see. They wore long coats, almost robes, the same light-drinking black as their ships, hung with little tokens and chains. Trophies, I learned later, they kept trophies. Their faces were narrow and long with 2 sets of eyes, a big pair and a small pair, all of them dark and wet and quick. No nose I could see. A mouth that was just a seam until it opened, and then it opened too wide. And they moved beautifully. That's what I couldn't get over, even at 14, even terrified. They moved like dancers, like the wind through the drying nets, smooth and unhurried. And there was something in the way they walked among my neighbors, slow, curious, reaching out now and then to tilt a face up toward the light with one long finger. That made my skin crawl right off my bones. They weren't angry, they weren't hungry, they were shopping. That's the word. I'm sorry. It's the only honest one. They walked down the line of my friends and my family, and my neighbors the way my mother walked the market stalls, picking things up, putting them down, deciding what was worth the carrying. There were maybe a dozen of them down there, and behind them, herding people into lines, were the others, squat, heavy things in gray armor, no faces at all, just smooth helms. The muscle, the soldiers. The corsairs gave the orders and the gray soldiers did the catching. I watched them separate the town. The strong ones, the young men, the harvesters, the women with good backs, they went into one group by the launch. The old ones, the sick ones, the very small children, the ones who'd bring no price in a mine, they went into another, off to the side by the ice house. I didn't understand at first why they were keeping the two groups apart so carefully. Then one of the tall corsairs walked over to the second group, the old and the small, and raised the thing in its hand almost lazily, like it was swatting a fly. I'm not going to describe what came next. I've described it before to people who needed to hear it for the records, and I'll never do it again as long as I live. I'll just tell you that the second group, the group with no market value, got smaller and quieter, and then it wasn't a group anymore. And the first group, the strong ones, they had to watch. That was the point of keeping them apart, so the cargo would understand, so they'd be quiet on the long ride out. The corsairs had done this 1,000 times. They knew exactly how to break a town's heart before they shipped it off, so the heart wouldn't give them any trouble later. My mother was in the first group, the strong group. I could see her. She had her arm around Tem, my sister, who was 11, and she had Tem's face pressed into her side so Tem wouldn't see, and she was looking straight ahead with the stillest face I have ever seen on a living person. She was keeping my sister out of the second group by sheer will, by standing tall and holding her up and making her look strong, so they'd both be counted as cargo and not as waste. Think about that. Think about the arithmetic my mother was doing on that dock. Let them take us. Taken is alive. Taken is a chance. That's the math you do when there's no good answer left, only a less final one. I have spent my whole life trying to be worth that math. The thing nobody expected. Now here's where the story turns. You'd think this was the end. A soft world. An unguarded town. Raiders who'd done it 1,000 times, who knew every trick, who had ships that drank light and soldiers with no faces. And against them, a few hundred fishing folk with rake handles and gutting knives. It should have been over before it started. By every law of how the galaxy worked, Saltmero should have just ended that morning, the way 100 other Edgeworld towns had ended, quietly, in places too far out for anyone to care. But there was one thing the corsairs didn't know. They didn't know what we'd been doing on Murith for the last year. See, I told you we were poor. I told you the combines didn't protect us. All true. But about a year before that morning, a ship had limped into our system. A small one. Combat's card, half-dead, trailing atmosphere. It had set down on the far side of the harbor on the long flat where the sea rice dried, and out of it had climbed a single human being. Her name was Sergeant Ada Cora. And she was the most dangerous person I have ever met in my life. I have to back up to tell you about Ada, because she's the whole reason any of us are here. She came to us broken. I don't mean weak. I mean broken the way a thing is broken when it's been used too hard. She'd been a soldier in one of the inner world fleets, a real one with rank and training and battles behind her, and something had happened out there. She never said what not to me that had cost her her unit, her ship, and most of her faith in the people who'd sent her to fight. She deserted, or fled, or just kept flying until the fuel ran out. Depends on who you asked. She washed up at Saltmero because Saltmero was the kind of place nobody followed you to. The town didn't trust her at first. A stranger with a gun and a haunted look dropping out of the sky. My mother told me to stay away from her. Everyone did. But Ada didn't take, she gave. She fixed the ice house engine in an afternoon, the one that had been dying for 2 years. She taught the harvesters how to read the weather off the high clouds the way the fleet read sensor data, and we lost fewer boats that season than we had in a decade. She was quiet and hard, and she drank too much, and she had a laugh when you finally earned it, like something rusty coming loose. And in the evenings, on the long flat by the drying racks, she trained us. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this sound bigger than it was. She didn't turn us into soldiers. You can't, not in a year, not fishing folk who have never raised a hand to anything but a net. She knew that. What she did was smaller and smarter. She taught us to not panic. That was the first thing, and she said it was the most important thing, more important than any weapon. She'd line us up on the flat and make sudden loud noises, flares, alarms, and the first month half of us would scatter like spooked fish. By the end, she could set off a flash charge right behind your head, and you just turn, calm, and look for the next instruction. She taught us to move together, to listen for one voice, to do the boring, unglamorous things: block this door, hold this line, pass that down the chain without thinking, because thinking is slow and slow gets you killed. And she taught a few of us, the steady ones, the ones with cold hands, to shoot. Not well, but enough. She didn't tell us why, not really. When the old council asked her what all the drilling was for, out here where nothing ever happened, she just looked at them with those tired eyes and said, "Because one day something will come out of that sky, and you'll have about 4 minutes to decide what kind of people you are. I'm trying to give you the 4 minutes." We thought she was a little mad, a soldier seeing soldiers in the clouds. We humored her because she'd fixed the ice house. 4 minutes, she was almost exactly right. When Ada saw the ship. So back to the morning. I was up in the rocks, frozen, watching my town get sorted into the living and the dead. And down on the far side of the harbor, on the long flat, in the little patched-up shack she'd built next to her dead ship, Ada Cora was waking up to the sound of something wrong. I didn't see this part. She told me after. She told me once and never again, and I've kept it word for word. She said the first thing she noticed was the light. Her shack had a slit of a window facing the harbor, and the light coming through it was wrong, too dim for that hour, a kind of gray, and she'd lain there a second thinking eclipse before she remembered Murith's sons didn't do that. It was the ship. The Corsair ship had moved in over the harbor mouth, and it was so black it had put a shadow on the morning. She said she was up and moving before she was properly awake. She said her body knew what that shadow meant before her mind caught up, the way an old soldier's body always does. She got to the window and she looked out, and she saw the launch on our dock, and the tall shapes moving among the people, and she said the bottom dropped out of the world. Because she knew exactly what they were. She'd fought them before, in her old life out there before Murith. The Corsairs of the Black Tide weren't a story to Ada Cora. They were the reason she had nightmares. They were, I think, the very thing that had broken her and sent her running to the edge of the map. And now they'd followed her to the edge of the map. Or fate had. She never could decide which, and it ate at her, the idea that she'd led them here somehow. Here's the part I think about. She had a ship, it was broken. But she'd been quietly fixing it for a year. That's a thing I only learned later. It might have flown. She could have run. She had a window in those first minutes, while the Corsairs were busy sorting and breaking and not yet looking her way. She could have gotten in her ship and lifted off and been gone into the dark and lived. She'd run before, she knew how, she was good at it. She told me that she stood at that window for a long time, long enough that the second group, the old and the small, had already gone quiet, long enough to watch it happen and know what it was. And she said the thing that stopped her wasn't bravery. She was very clear about that. She said bravery is a thing you feel before, and she didn't feel it. She felt sick and old and afraid. She said what stopped her was a girl. She'd seen through the slit of the window a woman in the strong group holding a small girl's face against her side, keeping her from looking. And Ada said she recognized that, not the people, she didn't know us by name yet really, but the gesture, the arm, the turning away. She said she'd done that once for someone a long time ago, somewhere out there, and it hadn't been enough, and that was the thing that had broken her. And she could not, she said, stand at one more window and watch it not be enough again. So she didn't get in her ship. She got her rifle, and she went to find the steady ones. The 4 minutes. This is the end of the first part of what I have to tell you, and I want to end it right where it really turned, because everything after this is consequence, and you should sit a moment with the turn. I was still up in the rocks. I'd seen Ada's shadow ship come over the harbor, and I'd seen the sorting, and I was so far past frightened that I'd gone numb, the way you do, where the world gets very flat and far away. And then I saw movement on the long flat. Small figures breaking from the houses on the western edge, low and fast, the way Ada had drilled them, keeping the drying racks between themselves and the dock, moving in the little rushes she'd taught us, up 3 steps, down, count to 3, up. I didn't understand at first. I thought people were running away. Then I saw they were running the wrong way. They weren't running from the dock. They were moving toward it, spreading out, taking the positions Ada had walked them through 100 times on lazy evenings while we laughed at her behind our hands. The fish house, the fuel store, the high ground behind the net sheds. Every position she'd made us memorize for no reason. Every drill we'd grumbled through, they were filling them, quiet, while the corsairs counted their cargo and never looked up, because why would they look up? We were soft cargo. We didn't fight back. Nobody on the edge worlds fought back. And down at the center of it all, walking, not running, walking, upright in the open, straight down the harbor road toward a dozen ancient star raiders and their faceless soldiers, was one human being with a rifle on her shoulder. Ada Terrorized. I learned afterward what she'd said to the steady ones. In the 30 seconds she had to say anything before it all came apart. It wasn't a speech. There wasn't time. She told me she just looked at them, at fishermen and net menders, and a baker and 2 harvest girls barely older than me, and she said, "They count on you running, so we don't run. We hold, and we hold together, and we make ourselves the most expensive thing they have ever tried to carry. Wait for my shot. Nobody fires before my shot." And then she walked out alone to draw their eyes, so the others could finish moving. I was 14 years old, flat on my belly in the rocks, watching one woman walk down a road toward the things that had murdered half my town. The 2 suns were high. Everything had 2 shadows. And I remember thinking, in this strange, calm, clear voice in the middle of all the terror, she's going to die. She's going to die right now, and it won't matter. I was wrong about that. I was about to learn what 4 minutes is worth, when somebody has decided what kind of people we are. But that's the next part. Don't think it was over. It wasn't over. Because the great black ship was still up there, putting its shadow on the morning, and the launch was still on our dock, and there were still GREY soldiers in the fight, and a single broken sergeant and 300 grieving fisherfolk had no way in the world to fight a starship. The 3rd tall one made it to the launch. We saw it scramble aboard. We saw the launch begin to lift, to run back up to the black ship and tell them, and bring the whole weight of the black tide down on us properly, orbital fire, this time. The thing they did to towns that gave them trouble. They'd burn SALTMARROW off the map and salt the ground and make us a story to scare the next soft world quiet. Ada knew it. I watched her watch that launch lift, and I watched her face, even from up in the rocks, and I saw her do the same terrible arithmetic my mother had done that morning. She looked back at the line, at us, at the people she'd given 4 minutes and a reason to, and then she looked at her dead ship on the long flat, the one she'd been quietly fixing for a year, the one that might just barely fly. And I understood before she moved what she'd decided. But that's the last part. The launch was lifting off our dock. I need you to feel how final that was. Down on the harbor, we'd done the impossible. We'd held the line. We'd pulled down 2 of the tall ones. We'd made the black tide run. For one shining minute, it looked like we'd won. But winning a fight on the ground means nothing when the enemy can climb back up into the sky and burn the ground from orbit. And that's exactly what that launch was going to do. Get back to the black ship. Tell them SALTMARROW had teeth. And then the black ship would stop trying to carry us and just end us, the way they ended any soft world that cost them more than it was worth. 300 of us, standing in a bloody line on the dock, watching that launch rise, and not one weapon among us that could touch it. Ada Korari turned and ran for her ship. Here's what I didn't know until later, and what makes the whole thing harder to carry. Ada's ship couldn't fly. I told you in the first part that she'd been quietly fixing it for a year. That was true, but fixing and flying are 2 different things. She'd gotten the drive to turn over. She'd patched the hull. But the thing had crash-landed half-dead a year before, and one critical system had never come back right, the inertial dampers, the part that keeps the people inside a ship from being turned to paste when the ship moves fast. She told the town's mechanic about it once in passing. He told me after. He said Ada had laughed her rusty laugh and said the ship would fly fine. It would lift, it would maneuver, it would do everything a ship should do. It just couldn't do any of it with a living person aboard. The first hard burn would kill whoever was flying it. She knew that. She'd known it for a year. She'd kept fixing the ship anyway, a dead man's ship, a ship that could only ever be flown once by someone who'd already decided they weren't coming back. I think, and this is just an old man guessing at the heart of someone long gone, I think she'd been building her own way out the whole time. Not a way to run. A way to matter, on her own terms, when the dark finally caught up to her. She'd come to the edge of the map broken and certain she'd run out of reasons to stand and fight. And then she found us, and we gave her one. 90 seconds. She got to the ship as the launch cleared the harbor. I watched her go up the ramp. I watched the drive light come on, that low blue glow under the patched hull. And up in the rocks, 14 years old, soaked in tears and somebody else's idea of what the day would be, I finally moved. I came up out of the rocks and I ran down the cliff road screaming her name, because some part of me had figured out what she was about to do and the rest of me couldn't stand it. I didn't make it in time. Of course I didn't. There wasn't any in time. Her ship lifted off the long flat, wobbling, wrong, trailing a thin line of smoke from somewhere it shouldn't. But it lifted and it turned its nose up at the launch and then it just went. I've never seen anything move like that. The launch was fast. Ada's ship was a thrown stone. It crossed the harbor sky in a heartbeat, a streak of blue and smoke, straight up the launch's throat, and the people on the dock, the line, my mother, my sister, all of them, every face turned up to the sky to watch. She caught the launch maybe 1,000 feet up. There wasn't any weapons fire. She didn't have weapons that worked. She just flew her broken ship directly into it. The light of it lit up the whole harbor, brighter than both suns. I felt the heat on my face from the cliff road. And the sound came after, this enormous flat crack that rolled off the sea and came back off the cliffs, and burning pieces of 2 ships came down into the green water all across the harbor mouth, hissing. And the tall one, the last buyer, the one who was going to tell the black ship we had teeth. It never made it home. The black ship leaves. We stood there, all of us, 300 fishing folk on a dock full of the dead, looking up at the sky. Because the black ship was still there. It still had us, you understand. Ada had stopped the messenger, but the messenger's masters were right there overhead, and they'd seen the whole thing, seen their buyers cut down, seen their launch turn to falling fire, seen a soft world that would not break. We waited to die. I'll be honest with you. We stood on that dock and we held hands, a lot of us, and we waited for the black ship to open up and burn us off the map, because that's what they did, and there was nothing left in all of Saltmoro to stop them. The black ship sat in the sky for a long time. And then it left. It just turned, and pulled its shadow off our morning and climbed back up into the dark and was gone. For years I thought we'd scared it off. I liked that story, the brave town that frightened a starship. The truth is colder and I think more important. The Black Tide were not warriors. I told you that in the beginning and I'll say it again here at the end. They were raiders. Their whole existence was built on one piece of arithmetic, that the cargo was cheap and easy and free. Take much, pay nothing. That was the entire business of 1,000 years. And Saltmoro had just changed the arithmetic. They'd come for cheap cargo and we'd cost them 2 buyers, a launch, a sky full of dead soldiers and a reaver lord. We had been, in the words they used out there, expensive. And a raider does not stay where the cargo is expensive. There are always other worlds, softer ones, cheaper ones, ones that still run. So they left, not because we beat them, because we made ourselves not worth the carrying. Because one broken sergeant had looked at us a year before and said, "I'm going to make you the most expensive thing they ever tried to take," and then she'd spent her last 90 seconds proving it. I won't pretend the after was clean. We buried a lot of people. We buried Pell, who braided sea rice into bracelets, and Orrin the baker, who gave me sweetbread for free, and 41 others who stood in the line. We buried the second group, the old and the small, who never got to choose anything at all. For a while there were more graves on the cliff than there were houses in the harbor. We never found enough of Ada Cora to bury. There's a marker for her on the long flat where her ship used to sit. The town keeps it clean. There are always bracelets on it, sea rice bracelets, the way Pell used to make them. The children do it now. They don't all know exactly why. They just know it's the thing you do. My mother lived another 30 years. My sister Tem is still alive, somewhere on the inner worlds with grandchildren of her own, and she was 11 on that dock, and she does not talk about it ever, and I have learned not to ask. And Saltmoro changed. Not all at once, but word got out. It always does. The story of the soft world that held the line, that made the black tide run, that flew a broken ship into the sky rather than be carried off. It went out across the edge worlds the way Ada said it would. Every world you've ever bled is going to hear what happened here. She was right. And the edge world started to do what we'd done. Drill, hold, refuse to scatter. They called it different things in different places, but in a lot of them, even now, even on worlds I've never been to, they call standing your ground together holding the marrow, after us, after Saltmoro. They don't all remember the woman's name, but they remember the line. The raids didn't stop overnight, but they got harder for the raiders, year by year, world by world, as the soft places stopped being soft. The arithmetic kept changing. And somewhere out in the dark, in their black ships, the corsairs of the black tide ran the numbers 1,000 times over, and one by one the soft worlds came off the list. A trade that had run for 1,000 years on the certainty that the cargo runs died slowly, on the day the cargo turned around. Nobody passed a law, no fleet rode out, no great power saved us. We saved ourselves in fishing towns and harvest worlds at the edge of the map, with rake handles and gutting knives and one borrowed idea about not running. I'm an old man now. My hands shake. I started this by asking you to remember standing on a beach at night, feeling small under too big a sky. I want to give you something to take with you instead. The things in the dark called us soft cargo. They looked down at a fishing town on a forgotten world and they saw nothing, no fleet, no walls, no weapons, no one coming to help. They were right about all of it. We had none of those things. What we had was each other, and a stubborn woman who taught us not to run, and 4 minutes to decide what kind of people we were. That was enough. So the next time you stand under that too big sky and feel small, remember that small is not the same as soft. Remember that the thing they could never beat was never our weapons. It was a line of frightened people who decided they would not break and stood next to each other and held. They came for cargo. They left a legend, and they never came back. And that, I think, is what we were always worth.